I'm Joe Park, CEO of Horizon Stewardship, and I want to welcome you to Unpacking the Giving USA 2021 report and what you can do in response to the information we're going to share with you today. Now, as we get started, it is the 2021 report, but the information we're looking at is from 2020. We'll talk a little bit about more toward the end of the program about some updated giving data that we'll be publishing next week. Joining me today is Christine Miller. Christine is Executive Vice President and one of the partners at Horizons. She and I have both been in this work for over 20 years, and we're excited to be sharing this with you today. Want to call your attention to our Horizons website. That's horizons.net. The slides that you're going to see today, along with a summary of recommendations, are going to be placed in Giving 365, which is our on-demand resource library. You can access that at using the upper right button that you see circled there. You're going to get a link that will take you there by Monday of next week. Then you'll be able to go ahead, download the recording, download the slides, and the summary page. Also in Giving 365 are hundreds of resources, blogs, videos, ebooks that are available to you at any point for no cost. So please, as you go in there and you download this information, look around and avail yourself of those resources. So we're going to begin today by looking at the brand new giving data that came from Giving USA. Now, Giving USA information, they've been putting this out for, since the 50s. But it's being produced by the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. It really is the primary source of giving for those of us who work in the philanthropy field. It is the most comprehensive of the reports, and so we're excited to bring this data to you today. There's a lot of good news if you're looking at giving on the surface. Last year, there was $471 billion given to charity. You can see that if you're looking at the graph, you can see that that's a record number. It's up 5.1% in 2020 over 2019. 2019 was up about 4.7% from the previous year. So over the last 2 years, giving has increased by about 10%. Now, what I want to call your attention to right now is the dotted lines. That is current giving. We're going to come back to the bars, but this is the dotted line that shows that giving has increased in all but 3 years of the last 40 years. Now, those are current dollars, actual dollars. So giving as a whole has been increasing. Now, I was doing a presentation last week at the Church Network conference, and we had a room full of business administrators, primarily from large churches. And so I asked the question, if giving has gone up by 10% over the last 2 years, how many of you have experienced a 10% increase in your giving? And there were actually very few hands that were raised in the group. So we're going to talk a little bit about why, if giving is going up, why so many of us in the church world are not seeing that level of increase in giving. So I'm going to take a moment and just share with you the sources of contributions. As we think about that, $471 billion, where does that come from? Well, 69% comes from individuals. And churches, that is our primary source of giving. We rarely get money from corporations. Bequests are a place where we also see but churches only get about 13% of bequests on average, somewhere between 10 and 15% in a particular year, even though we get a much larger share of actual giving. So while that is a source of revenue, it's not something that churches do well, and it certainly takes intentionality to succeed in that. Also want to show you that 14% foundations. We're going to circle back around to that and talk quite a bit about that giving and its impact on the total as we walk through these slides. Here is where giving, who received the giving. There are 10 categories, 10 major categories that are tracked in this report. And you can see that religion received the largest share, 28%. So that's more of the good news on top. Below that, 15% to education, and we're swinging back around. I want to point out to the gifts to grant-making foundations. Of that $50 billion, about 22 of it was given to the foundations, but not distributed. That's one of the phenomenons that we see, and we will address that later. But just looking at things on the surface, it looks like if religion is still America's favorite place to contribute. We know giving is going up. So why are we not all experiencing great joy about our giving? This is the same illustration that I showed you earlier, but I want to call your attention to the bars. The bars represent inflation-adjusted dollars, and this is what we're going to concentrate on as we go through our presentation today, because inflation-adjusted dollars are real money that we can spend. And when we get caught up on current dollars, that is not our best indication of how we are able to fund ministry. So when we're looking at inflation-adjusted dollars, several things happen. Where in total dollars, there were only 3 periods in the last 40 years that there was a decline in giving. When we look at inflation-adjusted dollars, we actually went backwards in 9 of those periods. Now, they didn't always happen during periods of recession. Those gold bars represent periods of recession. And you can see sometimes giving went up in recessions, sometimes it went down. And the reason that I point that out is in 2020, we were in a recession, and yet giving grew during that period. But you'll also notice that giving often contracts after recession, particularly that happened in 2008. And it took all the way to 2014 to catch back up with the giving. So I can't tell you for sure where giving is going, but I'll talk to you about some new data we have from a survey we did as far that indicates what churches are experiencing this year as they look at giving. So this is changes in giving by source. Now I want to remind you that we're looking at this on an inflation adjusted basis. And I want to call your attention to the changes that are going on there. Now, remember that churches, we primarily get our giving from individuals, and actual growth in giving from individuals fell. It fell from 4.7% growth to just 1% growth last year. You can see the big bump in giving to foundations. And that was largely driven by large donors who were transferring billions of dollars into their foundations. And many of those dollars didn't actually get spent or allocated. You can also see that there was a big bump in bequest. And this really had to do with the excess deaths that happened because of COVID. We're not going to see that necessarily repeating itself going forward. And so what I want you to see here is that while giving is going up, our primary source of giving, that coming from individuals, is lagging. Now you can see that that's not a new picture. And this is giving in 5-year increments. And you can see as late as 1985 that individuals were giving about 82% of all charitable dollars. And that has fallen to 70% um, last year. So we have been seeing a trend of individuals giving less, and that is compressing our giving as religious institutions who are primarily dependent upon that. You can see in that next bar that the growth that's been happening in foundation giving. And the other forms of giving, bequest and corporate giving, have remained relatively flat over time at about 9%. We saw last year that bump, but it's about 9% of total. But remember, as churches, we're not generally doing a good job of planned giving. So this one is changes in giving type by recipient organizations. And this is where the news shifts from being relatively positive to not very good at all on the religious side. Actual inflation-adjusted giving to religion declined last year by a fraction of a percent. It grew a little bit the year before, 1.7%. But if we look at it over the last 3 years, we've actually seen a decline in giving of about 2% in terms of our real purchasing power. Now, if you'll compare that to what's going on in other sectors, education, human services, foundations, public benefit societies, you can see that those have been growing. And that's a trend. What you're looking at here is pretty consistent with what's been happening over time. Religion has been growing at about half the rate of giving as a whole, and that decrease is actually accelerating, such that over the past 5 years, we're have generally been at the bottom or near the bottom in terms of growth in giving. So looking at this picture, just inflation adjusted dollars versus current dollars, this is that same chart that I showed you earlier. And if you look at the inflation adjusted dollars, you can see that really giving has been relatively flat over the last 40 years. We've been seeing about a 2.9% annual increase in inflation adjusted giving to religion, which is primarily made up of churches. Compare that to 5.1% that the rest of the giving sectors have been receiving. And you can see that we are in a recession. We are in a contraction in terms of what's happening toward religious giving. Yes, it's grown 37% over 40 years, which is great, but we're losing our ability to fund ministry, particularly in the last 5 to 7 years. So here we are in looking at giving spans, giving periods, 5-year giving periods. And I want to call your attention to the very bottom. If you'll look over here on the left-hand side, you'll see that this is giving to religion. And back in 1985, that was about 58% of all giving. You can see the decline that we have been experiencing as a percentage of total giving, and that's accelerated all the way to 29%. So if you think about it like this, over the last 40 years, we have lost about half of our potential total giving because we have not competed for those dollars in ways that have captivated the minds of our donors and potential donors. So I show you this slide to say, to illustrate what's going on with individual giving. We know that's our biggest share. And essentially over the last 40 years, Americans have been amazingly consistent, giving about 2% of our income to charity. That, when you look at it in the grand scheme of things, is really flat as a pancake. It has been a little lower since the recession in 2008 at 1.8, 1.9% of total giving. So where there is an increase in giving, it is not because Americans are becoming more generous. It's because Americans are becoming more prosperous and they're actually giving about the same amount away. Unfortunately, half as much is coming to religion as it was at the beginning of this period in 1980. So there's also some other shifts that are going on here. This is fewer Americans are actually giving anything at all. In 2002, now I want to tell you that this is coming from Gallup poll published recently, and it's not part of the Giving USA package, but I brought it in here to show you one of the factors that is squeezing our religious giving and why that's happening. So in 2002, 86% of Americans were participating in giving financial resources away. In 2020, that fell to 73%. So we've had a significant reduction in the number of households that are giving anything to charity whatsoever. The other thing that's happening is that giving is becoming more and more concentrated in the higher income donors. You can see here the changes in those that are making contributions. It's fallen in all categories, but households making less than $40,000 have fallen by 17%. Up to $100,000 has fallen by 12. Donors making $100,000 or greater, that has decreased substantially less. There's actually more giving coming out of that section. And the reason that that's happening is because since 1989, there's been a 13% decrease or shift in wealth from the bottom 90% of wage earners to the upper 10% of wage earners. So over the last 10 years, the upper 10% has been growing in both income and wealth. And that has shifted in the last several years. Two things have impacted it. The changes in the tax laws, estate laws that came about, I think, in around 2012, and the tax changes that happened in 2 or 3 years ago, where they reduced the tax rate on in several different areas. But what has happened is the upper 1% is the only sector of the economy who is growing in wealth today. So this is important for you if you to know who is in your congregation. If you have a congregation made up of upper 10% wage earners, those are usually households that are making about $120,000 or greater, or upper 1%. Those are households that are making around $250,000 or greater. Those are just rounded numbers because they're easier to remember. Then your potential has actually been increasing. But if you have a more blue collar congregation, there's a squeeze on because that sector of the population has a lower percentage of wealth and is also participating in giving at lower levels. This is a slide that I stuck in there that just illustrates the difference in giving. This specifically was about COVID relief efforts, but you can see that, or I can tell you that is consistent with other forms of giving. Those that make more money give more money. And the difference between $100,000 or greater in income, there's more than twice as many of those who intend to make contributions as those in households under 40. That also correlates very well with education. Postgraduates give the most, and college graduates in some college and down the line. So again, as you're thinking about who makes up your congregation, it gives you a picture of what their giving patterns are. Now, we know that you can change people's giving patterns, but if you are not employing best practices, this is what's happening. You're just riding the curve downward unless you happen to be in one of those top income brackets. I want to show you this one because it really speaks to wealth and untapped wealth. This is charitable giving compared to the Standard & Poor's stock index. The goal line is the Standard & Poor's, which, by the way, happened to set an all-time high again today. You can see that there's wealth increasing substantially over the last 5 years for people who hold stock, but giving is not keeping up with that. And so this sector who hold stock are getting wealthier, but we're not really tapping into that. This is important when you're talking about high capacity donors, particularly when you're looking at special giving and capital giving. There's a lot of stored capacity that has not yet been accessed. Last thing I want to point out to you is that we've got additional competition in the nonprofit world. Many of these nonprofits that you see illustrated here, 1.3 million of them are faith-based nonprofits. So consistently, as we do donor research, as we talk to donors in churches, we hear more and more people talking about, yes, I tithe, and I give part of my tithe to faith-based nonprofits. I give some of it to churches. And among the best donors in the church, over the last 5 years, we've been seeing a rapid decline in the percentage of what they give away coming to the local church. And that's a big concern. If you happen to have the higher capacity folks, yes, they have more income to give. Yes, they are being very generous, but they're giving less and less of it to the local church. So we're going to transition to talking about what you can do about that. But before I do, I want to invite Christine to make some observations about the patterns in giving that we've just discussed through these slides. Christine?
Oh, thanks, Joe. For those of you that are still on the line and haven't run from the room, this is a bit of a scary report. It's not substantially different than previous years, but there's some definite causes for concern in what Joe just presented. The number of donors declining, continuing declining, giving to religious organizations. We've lost a huge market share for the whole philanthropic pie. This last slide, increasing number of 501c3s that compete for those charitable dollars, and just an overall increase in complexity of the philanthropic landscape. Donors, those donors who have stuck with it, as Joe said, tend to be the more highly educated and have greater capacity, but they're also very savvy. And so churches really need to work to raise their game in order to increase their potential for attracting those charitable dollars. So a great overview, but the good news is that there are things that can be done that can help you to win back some of that charitable pie, and we're going to talk about those now. So a couple of years ago, Horizons began really looking at the work that we do with churches and faith-based nonprofits and asked ourselves, what are the fundamental aspects of the work that we do? In other words, if we stripped away all the tactics and all of those things, what's the essence of the work that we do, and what has the greatest impact for our clients? And so we arrived at these 5 disciplines, and we're going to go through them each individually. But it's important to keep in mind all 5 of these disciplines that all center around vision as you think about the strategies you can deploy in your church. So vision is at the heart of every ministry and generosity initiative. A clear understanding of your identity and how God is calling you to express it in your part of the world will keep you poised and ready to grow generosity. Many churches struggle with understanding their particular unique call to ministry in their service area. And if you're struggling with that, we partner with the Unstuck group to help churches to get unstuck and to really move forward in mission and ministry. So it's a great organization to work with. But based on the Giving USA data that we've just looked at, it is clear that donors, more than ever, want to support God-sized visions, and they want to help transform the world. And the church is just the right place for that to happen. So let's look at the first one. We love this quote from Lovett Weems: never talk about people's money apart from their discipleship, and never talk about the church's money apart from its mission. Those are really, really key and important to keep in mind as we think about how to keep it spiritual. Keeping it spiritual is foundational to every generosity initiative, whether it's capital, annual, planned giving, or special offerings. It's a key aspect that separates us from our secular nonprofit brothers and sisters. So keep this in mind as you're developing your generosity strategies, that we as a church consider generosity as primarily about a relationship with God. How and what we choose to contribute to the church says something about our relationship with God and our gratitude to the one who gave us all of those gifts. So make sure that whatever you do in terms of generosity initiatives, that you invite God into that process and continue to build disciples for Christ. I want you to just take note too, in each of these different 5 disciplines, you'll see a few items kind of called out there. And you can find each of those in the Giving 365 resource that Joe mentioned earlier. So as you go online, you can search for those titles and find additional information about how to keep it spiritual and the other disciplines that we're going to talk about. A Spirituality of Fundraising is a book that my colleagues and I recommend all the time. It's a brilliant book written by Henry Nouwen. There is a sequel to it that also includes a workbook. It's a great study for those who may be serving on your generosity team, and a great way for people to grow in their understanding of generosity principles from a spiritual aspect. So I'll just call that one out too, but the others are great resources for you as well. So based on the Giving USA data, just celebrate, preach, and teach generosity principles year round. And that's what you can do to grow generosity. So the second of the 5 disciplines is to build donor relationships. As Joe mentioned, working with high capacity and financial leaders has never been more important. These are the people that are continuing to support and invest in your ministries, and they will continue to be the ones that do the bulk of the giving as we go forward. So what does the Giving USA say to us? Well, declining number of donors, declining as a percent of disposable income. And it also says the higher capacity and more highly educated people are more inclined to make significant contributions to your ministry. So we need to be very, very careful about cultivating and stewarding those donors throughout the relationship with our organization. What we know about financial leaders and high capacity donors is that they tend to support many organizations. We said this to our clients that in your church, and so we need to be sure to make a case for including generosity in all our communication to our financial leaders. I had a conversation with a priest at a very large Episcopal church recently, and he said something to me that's really stuck with me since that conversation. He mentioned having a conversation with one of his prospective major donors, someone that had been involved and invested in the church for many years. And he was asking her to support the annual campaign with a 6-figure contribution. Her response to him was, how do I know that the church is still going to be around in the next 10, 15, 20 years? That's a really good question, and one that the church hasn't typically had to respond to. And so I think that it's important for us to be mindful that donors have many choices about how to contribute, and we want to make sure that we're making a case and tending to those donor relationships as well as possible. So the next of the 5 disciplines is telling your ministry story. One of my favorite business gurus is Tom Peters, and he has a habit of saying that leaders want to do stuff that matters. And so we as a church need to be able to tell our donors and our supporters how we are doing stuff that matters. We need to tell our investors how their resources, how their investment in the ministry is making a difference, and how we're transforming lives every day with the ministries that we're doing. You know, especially during COVID, we've heard all kinds of stories about how churches are engaging their communities, helping people in need. Now's the time to share these stories and tell members how you have been the hands and feet of Jesus during this time. How have you helped a family in your community? What have you done to raise up the ministry of your church during COVID? Everybody has a story to tell, particularly now. And it's an opportunity to continue to remind people that the resources that they're providing you are making a very big difference in the world and transforming your own little section of it. You can do this through offering talks. If you have not yet read A Better Offering, I encourage you to avail yourself of that resource. You can find it on our website. It's written by one of our colleagues at Horizons. It's a great book that gives you some ways and suggestions about how to help tell that ministry story, particularly around the offering, and make it a very sacred experience. You can enhance your giving statements. You can share stories through social media, also a great way to engage your community as well. Many churches use their staff meeting times to surface some of those stories, and pretty soon you begin to see those stories bubbling up more easily, and you can continue to tell those stories. So telling your ministry story is a great way to remind your supporters that you're doing stuff that matters, and tell them often and in every possible way about how you're making that happen. So the next of the 5 disciplines is making the ask. So, you know, we ask our people to support us in a variety of different ways. We ask them maybe to make a pledge. We do special offerings. We ask for donations online, maybe even text to give. We have moments for mission. We have youth group appeals, and et cetera, et cetera. But how we ask our donors to support us is really critical to our success. And this one is so important that we actually came up with 2 that fit this model. I was speaking to a pastor the other day, actually Joe and I were, and he remarked that the church needs to be careful to not limit the generosity of our members. I thought this was fascinating and very insightful. How often do we decide on behalf of our donors what they will or will not support? I've sat across the table from many church leaders who say, you know, we can't ask our people again. People are giving all they can. Or we presume that people won't give again after they've already made a substantial contribution. I can tell you that by thinking in that way, by deciding on behalf of our donors, that we are limiting our donors' expressions of generosity. One of the researchers that I follow a lot, Penelope Burke, did some research about a year ago, and it indicated that no less than 20% of people say that they would have given more They would have given more in any particular year, except they were not asked, nor were they compelled to do so. So there are people who are willing and ready to make a contribution to the church. So we need to be careful not to limit the generosity of our members. Another aspect of this is online giving, and I'm sure most of you doubled down in the online giving arena as of COVID, because that was the primary way that people were making contributions. Um, it is the latest research I saw, and this said 17% of religious giving is now happening online, and it's gone up. It's definitely increasing. Last year, I made contributions to, I think, 25 different churches and nonprofits through their online giving vehicles, whether that was through the website or through my iPhone or through my iPad. And I would encourage you to do the same. Test out your processes. Make sure that the process for navigating through your charitable giving portals is smooth, it's seamless, it's easy. I made a contribution to a seminary recently. I was able to make the contribution literally in less than 1 minute. It was a great experience. And by the time I clicked out of their website, I had an email in my inbox thanking me for my contribution. A note of caution here: when you're testing out your online giving vehicles, make sure that you check the default settings. Many churches and nonprofits fail to check that out. And sometimes people get a thank you for your purchase, or worse yet, thank you for making this transaction. We are in the business of transformation, not transaction. So make sure that you're checking your your online giving, to make sure that you're facilitating that donor process and thanking them appropriately. So last but not least is measuring effectiveness. We need to make sure that we're connecting with our donors and understanding how they're moving along that discipleship path. Donor analytics, which I'm going to ask Joe to talk about here in just a second, is just one way to identify the capacity of your current members and to see if you are perhaps underestimating some of your donors, or perhaps overestimating some of your donors and what they might be able to contribute. And looking at financial dashboards, because of the competition for donors, it's really important that we are retaining the donors that we have and engaging the donors on a deeper level, again, moving them along that discipleship path. So, Joe, you want to say a bit about kind of donor analytics and the importance of that?
I do. Horizons has something we call Horizons Analytics, and it involves a variety of different software tools that can help you as a church better understand what's happening and better identify potential donors. One of those is a capacity, propensity, and interest assessment that allows us to use public data from the church to identify high capacity donors within the church. It allows you to look at where giving is in regard to people's capacity. And that, especially if you're working with high income donors that are over $100,000, this is a critical tool that we encourage you to have conversation about using, determine if this is right for you and your church. The other is donor analytics software. We resell two different products, Mortarstone and Tools for Church. We do training and onboarding for that, so you can actually purchase that through Horizons. And what we found is most church management software systems don't provide you enough information in a helpful way to tell what's going on at the individual donor level. So it's incredibly important that you segment your approaches and you know what's going on under the surface. So for instance, if you use a donor analytic software like Mortarstone, our tools for church, one, it creates your dashboards for you. They happen right automatically. It's pulling information from your church management software. You just press a button, print, and there's your financial dashboards. So you can present to your leadership teams, to your finance teams, to your generosity and stewardship teams as much information about giving as they get right now on expenses. If you think about it, typically finance teams are looking at just a few lines describing giving, but all kinds of information about expenses. Well, that is available for every church to be able to actually look at that data. And you don't have to present names. In fact, we don't recommend in our report you present names, but you can look at the categories, you can look at the numbers, and they'll be able to tell the story without identifying names. So I encourage you, if you haven't checked it out, to give us a call and let us have a conversation with you about what the potential is. Be happy to do a demonstration of all of what I've just talked about.
The other piece of just that financial dashboards is just the strategies that can emerge from knowing that information. As we talked about earlier, with the declining number of donors, it's so essential that when someone gives a contribution to the church for the first time, basically saying, I want to be in relationship with you, that there is an adequate and appropriate response from the church reciprocating that, saying, we want to be in relationship with you too. And so using financial dashboards is a great way to identify first-time donors, maybe donors that are coming out of being lapsed donors, that maybe are coming back after COVID and saying, hey, I really want to be a part of this ministry again. And so there's some really wonderful strategies that you can use to deepen the engagement of those people with your ministry and get them more engaged and involved in giving, and therefore in the ministry and life of the church. So I think next we're going to go to the Q&A section.
We've just got one question submitted. So if you've got questions and you haven't submitted them, I would encourage you to do this. The first question is, as donors give more money broadly, doesn't the church become less of a pass-through organization for cash giving and more of a experiential giver, hands-on projects and stuff? I'm not sure that I completely understand the question, but I'll do my best to jump in and provide some information that I think will get at the heart of that, and Christine can add color to it. I think primarily what we're talking about are shifts in donor motivation that are related to generations, builder generations. That group of persons, they are about supporting the institution. They wanted to see the institution grow. Community really mattered to them, and institutions mattered. So you could talk about the needs of the church. You could talk about that, and that would motivate people. As we slide down to the younger demographics, especially picking up with Gen X's and millennials and Gen Zs, they really want to know what difference you're making. You've got to be able to measure the effectiveness of your programs and describe those, one face at a time, to motivate donors. At the same time, those same groups, the more engaged they are, the more likely they are to support you financially. So Church of the Resurrection, which is the largest of the Methodist churches, did a study and around engagement. They had a data scientist do this. I'm just going to use round figures so that you can remember them better. But essentially around that issue of engagement, people who come to worship one time or more per month, but less than 2 times, give around 1% of their income. Donors who come 2 times or more per month on average give about 2% of their income. if they get involved in a hands-on ministry or in a life-changing small group, and that could be a Sunday school, but one that there's a sense of community and discipleship, if they engage in either one of those two, that their giving almost doubles to around 3.5%. So absolutely, engagement, hands-on is becoming more and more important in your strategies to fund your ministry. Christine?
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, and I think perhaps the person asking the question was also reflecting on the fact that, as the church, we often are a pass-through organization to outreach ministries and to other organizations. And I think the church will continue to be that kind of an organization because it's not typically an either or. Most churches, if they are providing financial support to an outreach ministry, chances are they're also providing hands-on ministry with that same organization, or at least a certain segment of their congregation would be doing that. So I think another just aspect of that is because we know how many nonprofit organizations there are out there, and so many of them are also doing great ministry work. We need to be prepared to understand that we may or may not be a priority in terms of giving for any particular donor. But one strategy, one challenge may be to talk with your donors and say, of the 9 organizations that you contribute to annually, where would you say we fall as a priority in your giving, and how can we rise up in the ranks? What can we do to engage you more deeply and to be more engaged with you so that we might become a stronger priority in your giving? So it's a conversation to have potentially with some of your larger donors.
So, Christine, here's a question from our good friend Clayton Smith, who Speak of the Devil. We were just talking about Church of the Resurrection. Clayton is the former generosity pastor at Church of the Resurrection. And he asked this question: how best to help local churches with financial uncertainty of their members?
Yeah, thanks, Clayton. It's good to see your name there in your question. So we're in an interesting time in the life of the church and certainly in this country, where some people have come out of COVID with very significant financial reversals, as some would say. And yet others have come through COVID and are quite in the opposite position, who have a lot of excess resources. So I don't think it's safe to necessarily assume that everyone is struggling in your church, but it's also safe to assume that some are. And so finding ways to meet donors where they are, wherever they are in that discipleship journey, and being open to having those conversations with people to make sure that you understand people's financial circumstances and can help them through that. It's a wonderful pastoral care opportunity. And for those of you who want to avail yourself of some of the financial management programs that are out there, there are lots of those available out in the world. Joe, remind me the one that's recently an Abingdon publication that was just recently released to talk about money management. Do you remember the name? Well, I'll come up with it and put it in the chat.
Yeah.
I'll come up with it and put it in the chat. But there's a lot of those out there, and a great opportunity for you to offer that to your members and also to the community. So it's a great community outreach opportunity as well.
Christine, I apologize. I was reading the question more than listening to your answer. So you surprised me there. So Scott Sharp, Scott works with the Texas Methodist Foundation, and he asked this question, noting that we've been primarily talking about the general budget. How do you suspect this data informs us in terms of capital project or specific big price tag ministries? Scott, we are seeing that churches that are doing capital campaigns and are doing great. There is a lot of capacity out there, and churches that are making high quality ask that have done the work to prepare the church for a capital campaign are having tremendous results, even through the COVID period. In fact, the churches that move forward with capital campaigns during COVID did extremely well. So they actually picked a great time to do that. One of the things that we talk about at Horizons are our approach we call next level generosity. And that is the framework by which we help churches move from where they are today toward where God would have that church be. And we look at it in four forms of giving. There's annual giving, there's capital giving, there's planned giving, and there's special giving. And the special giving is the thing that we are seeing most on the rise. And that is for asking for big ticket items that don't rise to a full capital campaign for the church and may be related to a specific ministry. And so we are seeing particularly large gifts coming from high capacity donors. And long-term servants of the church who have some stored wealth around individual ministries and particular ask. That is going extremely well, but it is also something that you need. It requires one-on-one conversation, cultivation, and typically some form of engagement of that donor in the process. So it may be, if I'm a pastor of a church and I want to start a sports ministry or get some funding for a sports ministry in our church, that I take that donor out to a sports ministry in another church, and we just talk about it. We dream about the possibilities in our church. That's both involving the donor in the process and building personal relationships at the same time. So Drew Wiseman asked this question: is a donor's means of giving an indicator of their engagement? Christine, do you want to take that?
So I'm going to guess means of giving means how they choose to contribute, as in online versus writing a check or donor buys fund or something of that sort. And I would say their means of giving, I don't know that there's a particular indicator of their engagement, but certainly the level of their contribution has something to say about their level of engagement. And it's not to say that your largest donors are necessarily the most engaged, but we always talk about levels of giving relative to someone's means. So it's important to recognize that there may be people who are giving widow's mite kinds of contributions whose engagement can be very high relative to someone who may be giving one of your top gifts, but for that person may or may not be a particularly sacrificial kind of contribution.
Clayton Smith points out to us that Saving Grace is the name of the personal financial training module that's come out from Abingdon called Saving Grace. And it's written from a Wesleyan perspective. So if you're a Methodist church or one of Wesleyan descent, you may find this to be particularly helpful. It's patterned after Good Sense, which is the foundation of it. And then it's shaped to be focused on Wesleyan theology. Next question comes to us with the change in tax laws, with the standard deduction for charitable donations being $12,000 for an individual, $24,000 for a household. Wouldn't a strategy be to give to a foundation a sum greater and then have the foundation give to the local church over a period of years? Christine, this great opportunity to talk about donor advised funds and strategies related to every other year giving.
Yeah, so this is a great question, and one that we talk a lot about at Horizon. So donor advised funds, I mean, you saw in the Giving USA data the indication of giving to and from foundations increasing. And we've asked the question of the Giving USA people, where do donor advised funds exactly fit into that? And they assure us that that's not being double counted, but we suspect that the increase in foundations, both contributing to and resource coming from those foundations, has a lot to do with the increase in popularity of donor advised funds. So if you're not familiar with donor advised funds, quick explanation is it's a wonderful planned giving tool, and also a tool to deal with that tax law change. So when a person wants to make a contribution, they can contribute to a donor advised fund, usually through community foundation or other kind of banks. Many of them have it. Foundations like the Episcopal Church Foundation, United Methodist Foundations, all have the ability to create donor advised funds on behalf of donors. And basically what happens is, if a donor gives a $25,000 contribution to a donor advised fund, the donor is able to take the tax deduction within that calendar year, but doesn't have to give that gift or any portion of that money to any charity at all. Now, eventually it all has to go to charity. But if it is my suspicion that I know anecdotally that we're seeing a real increase in the number of churches that are receiving gifts from donor advised funds. It's a great tax tool for those people who have resources. I also suspect that one thing that is going to be happening is that people are contributing to donor advised funds for the tax advantages, building up this resource to enable them to do something major at some point in their future. Remember, I said, Tom Peters said that people want to do stuff that matters, and donors by and large want to do something that is transformational. If you don't have a God-sized vision, people aren't going to be willing to support it. So I suspect that there's going to be more and more opportunity to engage donor advised fund resources down the road. If you don't know about donor advised funds, or you're not sure how to attract them, the Community Foundation is a great way to start. Make sure you build relationships with them, and make sure that you include information in all the materials that you're sending to your membership that you are willing and able to accept gifts from donor advised funds. There are a lot of people that are confused about the IRS regulations on that, and you should be familiar with those. But churches, if it's for a gift to the church without strings and without benefit of any kind of product or anything that comes to them, if it's just a gift to the church, you can accept gifts from donor advised funds. So I encourage you to familiarize yourself with that, and get to know your community foundation so that you can attract some of those gifts.
Thank you, Christine. This is going to be our last question. It says we've experienced an increased mobility among our congregants, particularly younger families, and they've made decisions to live elsewhere, work differently. While people have always been mobile, moving in and out of high cost to low cost areas, this seems to be a major shift that's likely to continue. All the strategies you've highlighted today address this in part. Any additional thoughts? I would. We're about to, in our next Generosity Advantage, which is our blog, followed by a little less than 50,000 persons. If you're new to Horizons, signing up for this webinar will get you access to the Generosity Advantage, as well as signing up for Giving 365. That comes as an added benefit. But one of the things that we see is that the giving in 2021 from a survey we just completed is the larger the church, the more likely you are to have experienced increase in giving. I think a lot of that has to do with the focus that larger churches have had on a hybrid church experience, a high quality online experience. They've been building recurring giving for a long time. I've got clients that have over 90% of their income coming in through recurring giving. And so a hybrid church, making sure that you have excellent communication and engagement channels, that you are staying in contact tact with your congregation. All of those are critical and increasingly important, regardless of the size of the church. And so, what we're seeing among our best and growing churches is they've essentially said, you know what, with online worship, and they've gotten good at it, it doesn't really matter if people are in our community or not, if they want to join our church from outside the community. And so we're seeing strategies like that being adopted by many of our growing congregations, even some of the smaller ones that have invested in this technology. So as people become more mobile, you've got to react more quickly. That's a great reason to have great donor information, like we were talking about with that comes from Waterstone, where, for instance, if you've got a first-time donor, second-time donor, or a lapsed donor, it populates names so you can react quickly to onboard people. Getting them engaged quickly is a really important strategy for this rapidly changing mobile congregations and communities that we see. So Giving 365, as I mentioned, has hundreds of resources in it, and some of those very specific points are addressed in vlogs that we have created. In addition to that, if you would like to have a conversation with someone, just a conversation partner about some ideas or thoughts or questions you have, you can reach out to us on horizons.net. There's various places you can connect and send us a message, and we will be very happy to have that conversation with you to help you in whatever situation you find yourself. So I think everybody who has been a part of our webinar today, we're going to sign off now. I want to remind you that you'll be getting a link to these slides and this recording and a summary document that'll arrive to you on Monday or before Monday of next week. Feel free to share that. I hope you'll avail yourself of the resources in Giving 365, and you won't hesitate to reach out to us here at Horizons if you've got any questions about what we've talked about today, what's in Giving 365, or maybe you're looking for something in Giving 365 and can't find it. Christine, anything you'd like to say before we say goodbye?
No, I just appreciate everyone's time this morning, this afternoon, wherever you are, and look forward to hearing any questions or comments that y'all have. So thanks for joining us.